All right, so thanks very much for coming. It's really lovely to be here and on this beautiful day in Montreal. Same weather we have in Ottawa, just wonderful. So I'm happy to be here today to talk to you guys about self-driving laws and a couple of things that I think about that. So we're going to begin with 3 short stories. The first is a story about the inductivist turkey. So the inductivist turkey is a thought experiment from Bertrand Russell. And he theorized about a turkey who would wake up in the morning and he would be fed every day at 9 o'clock. And of course, the turkey doesn't want to make any assumptions. I mean, maybe he's going to be fed tomorrow again at 9 o'clock, but maybe not. So being a good inductivist, the turkey doesn't make any assumptions about what's going to happen next. And he gets up the next day, and once again, he gets fed at 9 o'clock. So he gets up again the next day, and he's fed at 9 o'clock. And this goes on for several months, every single day at 9 o'clock. And he thinks, you know what? I think we can really start to rely on this. I am pretty sure that from now until the end of time, I'm going to get fed every single day at 9 o'clock in the morning. But then, of course, the day he finally figures this out is Christmas Eve. So he gets up in the morning, and so much for the inductivist turkey. The second short story is a book called How to Talk About Books We Haven't Read. And this book was introduced to me by a woman when I was having a conversation with 2 colleagues about which of the Matrix movies was the best. And she somehow managed to insert herself into the conversation and take the topic from the Matrix to 6, 7, 8 other ideas within 2 or 3 minutes. And she says, well, I came in at the Matrix and I got us all the way to Scientology, so I'm out. And afterwards I talked with her and I said, well, it's so interesting how you managed to take our conversation, which was really just about which Matrix movie is the best, and take it all the way to this other thing so quickly. And she said, it's particularly interesting because I've never seen The Matrix. And I said, well, that's interesting. It's interesting that you came and joined our conversation about the Matrix movies in light of this. And she said, well, have you ever read this book? And it's called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. And I said, no. She said, well, what if I said to you that something was a Lolita-esque character? Would you know what that meant? And I said, yes, of course. You know, you have this vision of like an older gentleman, a younger girl, possibly a teenage girl. And she's like, well, have you ever read Lolita? And I said, no, I never actually sat down and read the book. And she's like, this is this guy's point, is that we have this capability to situate these ideas, that we have a cultural context and a lateral thinking mechanism for what these things are. So even if we never sit down and read the classics, even if we have no idea about Nabokov, we still know what that means. The third short story is about the musical Wicked. Has anyone ever seen the musical Wicked? Great Broadway musical, right? And so there's this part where the Wicked Witch of the West is singing with the wizard. And he asks her, you know, she says, well, that isn't true. And he says, well, you know, Elphaba, where I'm from, we believe all kinds of things that aren't true. We call it history. And he goes on to sing that, you know, someone might be called a liberator or a traitor, depending on who's telling the story, right? A rich man might be a thief or a philanthropist. You could be a crusader or a ruthless invader, depending on which version is able to persist. So we're going to leave all of that aside for a minute, but I ask you to keep these 3 short stories in the back of your mind, and we'll come back to them at the end of our conversation today. So today we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to begin by talking about machine learning algorithms, which is probably why you guys came and not to hear me tell 3 short stories. And we're going to go through some of the science around that and some of the common problems that come up. Because one of the things that I've found when we talk about machine learning and talk about algorithms is that people are not always talking about the same thing. People are not always on the same page about what those things mean. And then we'll go on to talk about what I call in law the Machine Regulation Thesis, or this idea that society might be better if humans just got out of the way and we let machines do the governing for us. Then we'll take a deep dive into everybody's absolute favorite topic, legal theory. I know, very exciting. And in particular, two things that I want to touch on today. One being the rule of law, and the other being the idea of law functioning as narrative. And then maybe, hopefully, we'll come back to those stories and possibly tie all of this together. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, I think that it's important to take a minute and sort of define what our parameters are and what it means to talk about the algorithm. Because people have different ideas about what this actually means. And first of all, I think we need to carve out what we're not talking about, right? So we're not talking about artificial intelligence in the sense of a science fiction movie where you have these anthropomorphized robots in the way that is conceived of by Isaac Asimov, and they're going to, walk off the assembly line floor at any moment and declare war on humanity. That's probably not what we're going to end up with. There's a book by Nick Bostrom where he talks about the singularity and the end is near and that kind of stuff. And one of the things he theorizes is this idea of the Paperclip Maximizer, right? So the end world, maybe not with a bang, but with a paperclip, where if you were to give a AI the discrete task of optimizing the quantity of paperclip production, which seems like a pretty easy task, that they might, start coming up with more and more creative ways to do this over time, and eventually, if their single-minded goal is paperclip maximization, you might, get rid of all industry on Earth. You might get rid of all people on Earth. You might convert all of that into base materials or things to make more paperclips. And then, of course, we end up with the end of the world because of paperclip maximization. Somebody, if you Google this, there's a really fun little web tool that somebody built where you can do this and see how long it takes you to destroy the planet by optimizing the creation of paperclips. But regardless, we're a very far way away from this. And when we talk about AI as a broad idea, what we're usually talking about is better called AGI, or artificial general intelligence. The idea to come up with ideas all on your own and do new and different things. And these are the robots of science fiction that we get worried about. And so when we think about AI, we need to be sort of discrete in our analysis. And this is something that Bill Smart and Neil Richards call the Android Fallacy, right? This idea that if we're going to think about how to regulate robots and how to regulate AIs in meaningful ways, we need to know what they can do, we need to know what they can't do, and we need to know what they never are going to be able to do. And then recognizing that never is a really long time, they say, well, okay, long after we are dead is probably a workable standard. And so the AIs that we have today are better described as ANIs, or artificial narrow intelligences, right? So we have the ability, we have specific coding of, did I send this to sleep? Yeah, it's back. We have specific coding to deal with particular problems, and we have pattern-based computational processes that enable various automations in the world that we live in. And so these pattern-based problem solvings are powerful computational tools. They enable these automated processes, and it basically boils down to what are robots, what are AIs really good at is math and any activities that are easily reducible to math. So those are the things that we are really empowered to see today. And then we have machine learning, right? And we hear about machine learning in various applications more and more frequently now. And so what does that mean? This is a computer program approach that allows the programs to learn from experience and improve at doing tasks over time. So a problem is represented, that problem is evaluated, and then it's optimized through iterative processes that has advanced pattern matching capabilities. At its basic level, an algorithm just means turning an input into an output, right? So if you're talking in computer language of binary, this is turning a 1 to a 0 or turning a 0 back to a 1. And normally, when we have computational processes in computers, the data is the input and the output is the desired result. And so what's different about machine learning applications specifically is that we already know both the input and the output. We know the data, we have the data set, and we have the desired result. And what we're doing now is trying to get the computer to get from one to the other in the most efficient way. And it has ways of learning, writing its own program in order to do that. So the computer writes its own program, and the programmer, after sort of setting up the environment in which this is going to take place, takes a back seat and doesn't do too much else. And so there are various ways of doing this, right? There are a whole plethora of different ways of doing machine learning. We don't need to talk too much about them, but we know that there are some really big ones like naive Bayes, which is like a Bayesian representation of the mathematics, the nearest neighbor algorithm, which is this one most like, or decision trees, which are going to be like how to play a game of chess or whether a credit card transaction should go through, following a chain of logic all the way down to get to a particular outcome. So when we think about the most common examples of how machine learning algorithms are working in our daily lives, we can think about them as a classification system, and specifically a great example is a spam filter. So this is, I borrowed this example from Pedro Domingos, who has a great book called The Master Algorithm, which talks about computer science stuff in a really workable and understandable way, if you're interested in learning more about that. And start with the premise of why would we want to automate that kind of process, right? Because nobody likes spam. Spam is annoying. It's like objectively undesirable. And nobody has time or inclination to go through each and every email that they receive and say, yeah, this one's good, this one's bad, this one's good. And so this is the type of process that a machine learning algorithm can be really helpful for. So we take this kind of mathematical approach, and if it starts to perform well, you might say over time that it becomes intelligent. But really all that it's doing is detecting a pattern that can serve as a proxy for some sort of cognitive task. And so in this situation, you have your data set, and then you have this jth arbitrary condition, right? That in the situation of the spam filter is the things that it's going to learn from the data set. So maybe there's like an easily identifiable phrase like earn easy money, or the name of a common pharmaceutical that has been misspelled in a particular way that's going to alert the algorithm that, yes, this is a spam message. This has been misspelled. This is about, big pharma, easy money. And at the outset, the algorithm probably isn't going to work very well. It's going to be somewhat anemic because it has only been exposed to a training data set with a number of emails that some of them have been flagged as, yes, this is spam, and some of them have been flagged as, no, this is not spam. And so that's all the algorithm has been exposed to. But over time, and as it is exposed to more and more data sets, it's able to do that pattern matching more and more quickly. And so as it is able to detect new and better patterns from additional data, that can be said to be called learning. What's interesting is that some of this deep learning capability and machine learning capability, which is so new and talked about, breathlessly about AI and the algorithm, is that a lot of this is quite old technology in terms of the way that the math works and in terms of the way that people had been talking about deep learning even all the way back in the 70s. But the difference then was that the data sets for these to operate upon were missing. And now that we live in this world where anybody with a smartphone-enabled business is collecting all kinds of data, the data sets for the first time are available for people to do meaningful and interesting things with them, right? So the data is already, let's stay on this one for a second. So I like this quote. People worry that computers will get too smart and take over the world. But the real problem is that they're too stupid, and they've already taken over the world. So let's think about a couple of different ways in which we're already using machine learning algorithms on a daily basis. So a good one that most people are pretty familiar with is the Amazon algorithm, right? You buy something on Amazon, and Amazon has an interest in you buying more things. So there's that little bar that comes up at the bottom. You know, people who bought this also bought. You might also like. And their business model is based on getting you to spend more time on the site, buying more things, and the more closely that they're able to predict your behavior, the more closely that they're able to say, yes, if I show them this, they're going to click on it. If I show them this, they're going to like it, then the better they do, right? So that impacts their bottom line. That makes it a more attractive option for them. Netflix is another example of how we use algorithms in our daily lives. But what's interesting is that their algorithm operates quite differently, right? If Netflix just showed you the things that you might be most likely to watch, well, that might be entirely limited critically acclaimed movies or recent releases, all of which is more expensive for them to license. So the way Netflix solves this problem is by asking you to go down the long tail. They want to show you things that are like the thing that you wanted to watch, or things that are like the thing you have already watched, that are lesser known, that are older, or that are independently produced by Netflix, because all of that is cheaper for them to have on their site. And so when they show you those things and they do a good job of predicting what you're going to do next, you spend more time on their site, and hopefully you spend more time watching their original content, or you spend more time watching things that are less expensive for them to have on their website. So we see the way that these data processes are already coming into our daily lives and are doing things that kind of make sense from a corporate perspective, from these business models. And so we have these huge amounts of data that are being accumulated just from us being on the internet, us using our smartphones, us doing anything like that. And so these predictive models, or data-driven analytics that different people are using, really just boil down to the fact that humans like predicting things. We're really into that, right? And if you don't believe me, try telling your romantic partner that you're not really sure where this relationship is going, or try telling your parents you're not so sure you want to be a lawyer after all, right? People like predictability. And we used to have soothsayers and shamans and that kind of thing to help us, but now we have big data, and we have smartphones, and we have cookies on the internet. So, what does this all mean for the administration of law? This is all kind of fun. So Mireille Hildebrand, who's a Dutch philosopher, legal philosopher, talks about the idea of smart technology as sort of an entry point to the ends of law. And so in her book, which is really great, and I recommend it very strongly, is that she begins it with this idea, and it's kind of like in Ray Bradbury's There Will Come Soft Rains story, right, where there's this smart house. And you wake up in the morning, and the smart house, greets you, tells you the weather, helps you dress based on your schedule for the day. It feeds you a breakfast that is like perfectly calibrated for what you need and what you're going to need to do. And based on the traffic conditions, it'll come back for you. Based on the traffic conditions, it recommends how you're going to do your commute to work and all of this. And through, interrogating some of these assumptions about rule following and thinking about how technology starts to subtly undermine the behaviors that we engage in our daily lives, it brings into question, the entire administration of our lives, something that law has traditionally been really involved with. So we have this idea that we have delegated responsibility to legislative decision makers, and we have administrative oversight of those various entities that enables us to make sure that power has been delegated appropriately and that there is oversight of how those things take place. And at any instance in society where there is decision-making authority, particularly in administrative tribunals and in the judicial system, there is a degree to which we want to make sure that those decisions are going in accordance with a story that we've told about how society operates. And so we see a couple of problems emerging as we go to a reliance upon technology, one of which is that we might be undercutting the way that we understand ourselves in relation to the law, and another being that over-relying on these machine learning algorithms, over-reliance on these things is not necessarily better or faster just because it's new, but in fact there are a whole bunch of problems that can arise if we're not careful and specific with the way that we talk about these things. So one of the things that I want to talk about just for machine learning harms that emerge from a broader consideration of this, and then we'll go more specifically into talking about machine regulation of the law itself. And so I gave them flashy names because I think that that is helpful and fun, but they're not real names, they're just my names. So the first one is the brute force application. And I like to talk about this with this example. So does anyone recognize this picture? Someone want to yell out what it is? The napalm girl, right? And so this is a very famous picture, right, from the Vietnam War, from I think it's 1971. And this was one of the things that really turned the tide in America when people began to understand some of the implications of the Vietnam War. It's like won the Pulitzer Prize and is very well known in photojournalism as having been really significant and important. And so a couple of years ago, in 2016, there was a big backlash against Facebook when somebody had shared this particular image and it had been flagged for child pornography. And so it had been removed from their site almost immediately. And people were outraged, and one of the people who was outraged was actually the Norwegian Prime Minister, who wrote to Facebook and said, what's going on with this? And there was a back and forth, and eventually the photo was allowed to be used online again. But it's interesting because this brute force application, it necessarily treats all data points the same. So if you're identifying this and you say, oh, there's a child in it, the child is naked, therefore this is necessarily child pornography, and that can't possibly have any other merit associated with it, right? Never mind that this is an important photo, that this is a classic example of photojournalism, that it has been important in geopolitics for various reasons, and that the subject of the photo has explicitly granted her consent that this photo continue to be used because she understands its importance as a merit. It's actually interesting to note that it's not entirely clear whether this decision was made by a machine learning algorithm or by actual people, and that has been disputed some online. But it doesn't actually matter at the end of the day in terms of it being an illustration of what happens when you rely on checks and balances, where everything looks the same and you don't have any flexibility with the application of a rule. The next one is something I call the discrimination permutation. And that's the idea that algorithms can be biased. And I think people have talked a lot about that in terms of the fact that there have been racist algorithms, that things have been perpetuating the kinds of things that we see in society that we don't necessarily like. And if we have a data set based on the way people behave, and we don't like the way people behave, then what we're going to be replicating might be problematic. So a couple of interesting examples there. One is a Google machine learning algorithm that improperly characterized two African American people as being gorillas, which was very, very insulting and was immediately corrected, but was an example of sort of the other face recognition bias that happens in machine learning, particularly with facial recognition software. And this, I don't know if anyone remembers Microsoft chatbot Tay, who was put on Twitter in order to learn natural language processing capabilities in the summer of 2016. And so Tay was super psyched to meet humans. And within 24 hours after interacting with people on the Twitterverse, had become basically a misogynistic, racist, anti-Semite by learning the information that was freely available out there in the world. I'm not going to read any of that aloud. You can see it. It's all a little bit alarming. All right. The next one we call the privacy dissociation. And so I think there's no better example of the machine learning problems that can arise from privacy than the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook of last year. And I want to make one particular note on this, which is that we often talk about privacy and data as if people can give consent. And if you've given your consent to the dissemination of your data, then we don't have any problems anymore. But one of the things that machine learning makes clear is that there's an aggregation effect where information that was perfectly fine on its own, when combined with the information of hundreds of thousands of millions of other people, reveals patterns that never would have been possible otherwise. Reveals things about health, reveals things about statistics at a population level that if you as an individual had given consent to that information, you wouldn't have been worried about it. But now, once that information has been combined with the information of millions of other people, new things can be drawn from it that you would not have anticipated. So this consent-based framework has become a bit anemic in the face of these machine learning applications. The last one we call the Opacity Paradox, and this is something that we all refer to as the black box society, right? This idea that there are all these algorithms that control the way money and power work. Great book on this by Frank Pasquale, who writes about how we don't really understand so many elements of our lives now because of these subtle machinations that work in the background. And I mean, they are doing interesting things with neural networks in terms of making them more intelligible and making them able to suggest some of that information to us. But at the end of the day, unless we're able to really see through that and understand how decisions are being made, there is an impoverishing that necessarily happens in terms of understanding how those frameworks work. All right, so I'm going to move now to talking more specifically about the law and how machine learning coincides with law in spaces where scholars are starting to use this idea about machine learning algorithms to streamline the administration of justice. And so you can see how, based on some of these problems and harms that we've mentioned, that there might be problems with that, right? So if we have privacy concerns. I mean, the NYPD has been using iris scans to identify prisoners due to making sure that people don't switch around when they're in lockup. You can think about some of the different problems with discrimination in terms of bias, especially race-related bias, right? So very Minority Report-esque discussions that have been had around identifying crime hotspots, around thinking about likelihood of recidivism and using sentencing software that specifically is targeted towards the specifics of a person's outcomes and defining their sentence very specifically based on that. But we have, of course, some concerns about how these things can be deployed in a way that is not racist, that is not biased, and that kind of thing. So those are some sort of entry-level examples of how we're starting to see this in a criminal law context. But more broadly, and sort of taking a higher level approach, there are some scholars who talk about a wholesale change to the administration of justice in terms of these numerical approaches. So in particular, I'm thinking about the work of some professors at the University of Toronto, Ben Allery, Anthony Niblett, Albert Jeunes, who talk about this idea of regulation by machine. And so this is not, this idea of robot judges per se, but instead it's an idea of what they call the legal singularity. So the idea that we have more and more data points and we have more information, and perhaps at a certain point you'll be able to say, you know what, the law is a complete data set. And based on that, we'll have the ability to accumulate this data and use it to define legal certainty. And so they deploy this example in a couple of different ways. And essentially it's like talking about a machine learning model that will tell you what the outcome is going to be so that you can proceed accordingly. This is like what Oliver Wendell Holmes, the American jurist, says about the law, right? The prophecies of what the courts will do in fact are what I mean by law. So this regulation by machine idea comes from that sort of conception of what the law is. That the law is a system of predictability. That the law is saying what the courts are going to do. And in the context of their legal singularity argument, there's two kind of key applications that I think help make sense of what they're arguing. And one of them is about tax law. And tax, you can see that it would make sense, right? Because it's a highly technical code. It's the kind of thing that has a lot of rules that are very specifically spelled out in terms of this is what the law is. And it's also something that is confusing to the average person. And if you're not a tax lawyer and you're not highly trained in this, it can be helpful to have a way in to that in terms of, say, there are factors for determining whether someone is an independent contractor or an employee. And maybe if you're able to input your factual situation into this matrix, the matrix will tell you, based on those machine learning algorithms and considerations of various points, what your legal likelihood is. Another example of this would be these applications in medical malpractice law, right? Maybe this is a tool that doctors could use at some point in the future in terms of defining what the standard of care is in relation to their very specific patient. A personalization approach where you say, okay, these are the factors and they're all inputted, and this enables the doctor to act in such a way that can necessarily be considered to be of the standard of care. So that subjectivity, that whole analysis in negligence law of whether someone has accorded themselves appropriately ends up not mattering so much anymore because this specificity has been garnered by the process. So this is, in another paper, Niblett calls this the personalization of law, right? And that law generally has power, but becomes much more important when it is personalized. So it only takes on real meaning when a judge takes your circumstances into consideration and applies the law specifically to your personal circumstances. And so in this articulation, machine learning enables this personalization of law in a new and different way. And as is often argued by these scholars and others who argue for the administration of justice, that it would be better, right? Because we know that we have all kinds of problems with the administration of justice, including backlogs and things are slow, and also that judges can be fickle and not necessarily able to deliver the same standard of care or standard of judging to everyone all of the time. There are legal realist studies that propose that a judge is more likely to be favorable to your case if they recently had a snack break, if they recently ate lunch, if your case is in the morning, there are statistically significant outcomes as compared with if your case is in the afternoon. So we know that there's this problem, and this is proposed as a possible solution. So the paper where they talk about the personalization of law ends with this quote. And they write, "It will not be technological infeasibility or lack of data standing in the way of personalized law. It will be the inability of humans to agree on what the law is designed to do." All right, so what is the law designed to do? Because this is a question that people have lots of different ideas about. So last year I was at the We Robot conference, and I was sitting there and I was listening to a panel of technology law academics who I really look up to talk about how law works in its specific contours against policy. And one of them took exception to this idea that lawyers don't build anything as compared with, engineers or technologists. And he said, well, actually we do build something. We build the rule of law, and it's very important. Thank you very much. The lawyers are pretty into the rule of law, right? We talk about it all the time as this systematizing, overarching force that binds the world together. But the question is, what does it really do? And as with many things that we rely upon as central ideologies, it can be difficult sometimes to actually explain those things. The idea that we know that the rule of law is this normative constraint on the exercise of power, but what else does it do? And when we think about this thing that is central, it's kind of like eyeglasses that we've worn for a long time. They're nearly invisible. We use them to scan and understand the world around us, but we don't really examine it for itself very often. And so we know on some level what the rule of law is, that it's this idea of non-arbitrariness, that it's an alternative to mob rule, that it's the rule of laws, not men, and that it constrains political will against the seductive will of the moment. And so theorists like Joseph Raz would say that the rule of law is fundamental to the propagation and protection of human dignity. And Mireille Hildebrandt would talk about legal norms being designed in constitutional democracies to consist of three key components: that they are democratically established by a governing legislative body, that it is possible for them to be violated, and that the violations are then evaluated, right? So they're penalized, if appropriate, by a court of law. And so this possibility of violation is kind of key to this governing framework, because it recognizes that there is a degree of free will that is placed into the operation of the people and the operation of the laws, and acknowledges that citizens might sometimes decide to violate the law based on their own assessment of whether or not that's appropriate. Maybe for nefarious purposes, maybe for virtuous purposes. We don't really know why. We also think about the law. This theoretical framework can be useful for understanding the law as a narrative. So understanding the law in terms of its storytelling capability. This helps us to situate ourselves in a legal universe where we understand the stories that we tell ourselves in terms of what the law should be. And so if we think about the law as a narrative, it is sort of a constraint on the functional pragmatism of judges and statutes. And in this way, law is a participatory social exercise, and through which we have a conversation about what are the norms that we are going to use to govern society, and how are those norms going to produce meaning. Narrative then is an interpretive tool and imposes a normative force on the world around us. And so when we think about the law in this way, it's almost like the expression of rhetoric. We participate in what we see in the world through the very act of describing it. And so that can be a little bit tricky to think about. But one example that I really like is from James Boyd White, who talks about what happens if you see a bear fishing in the river, right? And he's like, we would use this word fishing to describe what the bear is up to. And that would make sense to us. The bear is in the river, he's fishing. And we know what is meant by the word fishing. But if we see a person fishing in the river, it might be more complicated, because a person can have motivations and understandings about who they are and what they're doing that exceed that of the bear. So is the person, wearing some perfect clothes from the LL Bean catalog and engaged in this process of some sort of spiritual exercise? Are they just having a nice time? Are they on this eat, pray, love-esque journey into the wilderness? What if it's an indigenous person doing the fishing who has personal or historical connection with the land and with the fish. There are all kinds of motivations and understandings about that activity that might be more complicated than it was when it was the bear. And so, tying all of this together, we have an inability, I think, as people to agree right now on what the law is designed to do. And this is something that is highlighted by this argument that you could replace the governing features of law necessarily with machines. So if all of what the law is supposed to do is flip binaries, if all the law is supposed to do is say whether things are right and wrong, then maybe this is okay. But what about the law, as a narrative force? What about the law as a storytelling force? And so if we ask ourselves why we're so concerned about the predictability function of law, my view is that that predictability element, right, that is inseparable from understanding the law in its economic context, that you want to have certain efficiencies built into the system, that you want to have predictability built into the system because you want to understand things. And if you're thinking about it through an economic framework, through a law as economics, then that makes sense. And then this machine regulation thesis might really be useful to you in that framework in terms of predictability. But if we think about things in a broader sense, in terms of are we trying to do more than just predict the future, then we might end up with some more problems. And we have here LexUM's model of how law, code, norms, and markets all press against the individual in any model of regulation. And so what we would see if law becomes code and norms and markets are not considered in that element is sort of a conflation of the way that we understand regulation, where law and code become essentially inseparable and disturbs that kind of tension. So coming back to the beginning and the idea of the inductivist turkey, how to talk about books you haven't read, and the musical Wicked. So when we go to court, we ask the court not only to consider what the law is, but also what it might become. We ask what its application to a particular factual situation might mean, and maybe this is a little bit different in the civil law system, but I'm actually not persuaded that it is, because I think that there are a lot of really interesting civil law theorists who have talked about the law in meaningful and important ways since the 15th century. And I mean, even if that's true, you can still understand it from a charter litigation perspective, that the tools of the litigator, particularly the appellate litigator, reasoning by analogy, reasoning from first principles, appealing to moral truths or referencing, old-timey legal texts, all of these tools go beyond simply a binary recitation or movement from one to the other in terms of defining what our laws are supposed to do. And so in that sense, the rule of law is not just a tool that protects us from arbitrary exercises of power, but it's also a mechanism for telling stories, and is the most important story being the kind of future that we want to create. So in this way, this narrative thread, right, when you use the rule of law to argue, it's not only retrospective in terms of laws can't have a retrospective application, they must not be arbitrary, but it also has a prospective function in terms of having this link that connects past and future and delivers us into the kind of future we want to create. So that takes us back to these three stories from the beginning, right? How do we build a future based only on the past? And this is what data analytics do. This is what the mistake was made by our poor inductivist turkey, by expecting that the things that happened in the past were necessarily going to happen in the future. but they couldn't. And then how to talk about books we haven't read, about this ability that we have to draw connections from seemingly unrelated things, about this ability that we have to understand things from context and pick up on things from context without having specifically been exposed to that data. This is another thing that machine learning algorithms with a defined and specific data set are unable to do. And then finally, in the musical Wicked, the last part of that passage, he says, "There are precious few at ease with moral ambiguities, and so we act as though they don't exist." And so I think that one of the important things that we do in the law, in particular in the stories that we tell about law, is that we do grapple with those moral ambiguities. And being overly eager to delegate all of that decision-making authority to machines that have less of a nuanced approach to that, I think fundamentally impoverishes our understanding of how we think about the law, and in particular, impoverishes our ability to tell good stories. Thank you very much.